Hello everyone, my name is Natalie and welcome to or back to my channel. Now, I only created my YouTube channel about a month ago and I figured, you know what, I've not read that many books this year, so why not I just do a series of wrap-ups where I tell you everything I have read so far this year. Like I mentioned, this is going to be in multiple parts and this is part 1. I've got my Goodreads up because that's where I record and monitor all my books. So one book I read this year was The Man Who Mistook His Woman for a Hat by Oliver Sacks. I gave this one a 3 out of 5 stars and I do remember most of these books because thankfully I have that kind of memory. This is a non-fiction book and it's basically a book of, I don't know whether to class them as mini essays, but they are split up into multiple stories of actual patients that Oliver Sacks either treated or had colleagues who treated them, and I can't for the life of me remember what he was, but it was something to do with the brain conditions. And it was absolutely fascinating to read all these different things that these people suffered with and to see how their brains worked and how they were cured. What really lessened my enjoyment, now this was written in 1985 and also these stories take place long before then, so I think most of them, the patients are from cases that happened in the 70s, maybe a bit earlier. It was the language that was used that was back in the day official terminology, but it really pulled me out of learning because a lot of the time I was very almost disgusted with the words that were being used, and I'm certainly not going to repeat them here, but it was more medical terminology back then. And like I said, I was fascinated from the different conditions, and it is absolutely mind-boggling to think about, once you read it, the truly extraordinary things that can go wrong with the human brain or that can become illusions in the human brain so people don't perceive objects correctly. That was absolutely weird. It really was. There's stuff there I had never even thought of. Now, the next 2 books I read were actually 2 poetry collections, and these are both by Pam Ayres. So I read Pam Ayres' Some of Me Poetry and then I read her Some More of Me Poetry. I really enjoyed Pam Ayres' writing. I don't know if you know who she is. Back in the 1970s, she was very big on radio and she's known as being a stand-up comedic poet. I was about to say poetry person then, but I was like, no, there's a proper word for it. It's poet. She's a poet. And this is just 2 collections of her poetry. They're very funny. Some of them made me laugh because they're still relevant even today, and we still experience some of this today. Others, just because the language used was just funny to describe everyday stuff. Now, I gave Some of Me Poetry 4 stars, and then I gave Some More of Me Poetry, if I can find it, I gave that 3 stars. Now, another book I read early this year was actually another poetry book, and that was The Princess Saves Herself in This One by Amanda Lovelace. I loved this poetry collection so much, and I think the main reason for this is a lot of what was being spoken about I could completely get, because for me poetry is something that you more get a feeling, either you connect with poetry or you don't, and this one I completely connected with. In fact, I gave this one a 5 out of 5 stars, and it was the first book I'd given 5 out of 5 stars this year. Now, next up, I started reading an old series towards the end of 2020 and I finished the series off in 2021, and that was the Twilight Saga. Now, to be more specific, I read New Moon, Eclipse and Breaking Dawn. When I was a teenager, I was a hard stan for these books. I was so in love with them. I thought they were brilliant. I thought the characters were fantastic. When I was 17, I reread them and I'd fallen a little bit out of love with them, but I still loved them and thought the romance was great. Now I'm 25 and I reread them. Oh my god, I did not like it at all. every moment I was cringing. I was cringing at Bella. I was angry at her for putting up with all the crap she did, all the crap she like made other people feel. I no longer like this book series. I will not be reading this series again, or at least I hope nothing makes me read this series again. Not only that, but with saying that, later this month I do have a plan involving this series, but I feel like that's separated enough that I don't need to actually touch the actual books. But just to let you know, I mean, I didn't give them that bad of a rating. I think now, looking back on it, I'd probably lower my rating. So the original rating I gave them all was 3 stars, but honestly, I think I'd give them more a 2-star now. Now, the next book I read, which unfortunately I also didn't like, was called The Librarian by Sally Vickers. I thought I would love this book. You know, it's about a librarian, you know, it's a book about books, a book set in a library. I thought I would love it. It was set in like the 1950s. This young woman gets a job and first time moving away from her parents, moving into a completely different village, and it just sounded amazing. It was not. So some of my issues with this book were the writing style. A lot of the times I was reading it and it was like it was telling you information. It wasn't giving you any of what these characters felt, told you how they were doing stuff. It was really weird, and sometimes it wouldn't, for me anyway, sometimes it wasn't very clear what the characters actually were doing. Like it would leave off on something and I'm like, hold on, did they end up doing this or not, or what actually happened there? And then I'd think, okay, it must have been this, and then a few chapters later it would contradict the thing I thought, and I'm like, oh, they obviously didn't do that then because this is saying this. So I got confused. Another thing that I didn't like is this book. I don't really know what happened, because the first half of the book I really enjoyed our character. Yes, she was making some bad decisions, but she also made such good decisions, and she was such a likeable character. She was so nice, it was wonderful. Then we got to the halfway point, and the chapter after that, I don't really know what happened, but her entire personality had somehow changed, and it wasn't like the slow evolving, you know, of a character and, you know, character development. It's just like boom, suddenly she was this. Suddenly she was not the same character, and I could not root for her anymore because I had no idea where this new personality came from. It was just out of the blue. She just was suddenly no longer the character I had spent the last, I think it was like 250 pages reading about. And I gave this book a 2 out of 5 stars. So the last book I'm going to talk about is a book of folklore and fairy tales I read called Celtic Fairy Tales, and this is just a big collection of fairy tales taken from Wales, Scotland and Ireland, and I think there are a few from the south of Britain as well. And I really enjoyed this book. I absolutely adore fairy tales. I love reading about folklore, all that kind of stuff. So I felt like a kid again when I was reading this, because the stories are so short in there that it's pretty much made for kids. So each night before I went to bed, I would read a story of it, and it just took me back to being a child again. So I loved that. And I loved the different stories. These stories were actually created, I think in the 1870s was when this book was first published, and then it just has been continuously republished since. But yeah, I adore folklores, I adore fairy tales. This book was right up my alley. I do still have it, it's on a shelf behind me, and I do want to reread it and then maybe tab a few of my favourite stories so that when I want to I can just go back and just quickly find them and reread them. Because even though I adore reading books like that are short stories, I am so bad with names. I can't remember any of their names. I remember what some of the stories were about, can't remember what they were called. So having like a tab system in those kind of books definitely helps me. I'll show you what I mean. I think I've done it to one book. This is a book I'll talk about in the next one, but I read How Long Till Black Future Month, and all the stories that I enjoyed I have tabbed up. I don't really know how to tab properly, but at least I know how to find my absolute favourites in here, and that's what I want to do to Celtic Fairy Tales. Okay everyone, that's it for this video. Like I said, there will be a part 2, there'll probably be a part 3 as well. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe if this seems like content you would enjoy in future, and also leave me a comment down below and let me know the first book this year that you gave a 5 star. I'll see you later. Bye!